It is July 30th, 1930. 93,000 people are packed into a stadium that was only finished 4 days ago. The paint is still wet on the walls, and somewhere in the stands, an entire nation is holding its breath because they already know they're going to win. Rewind 18 months. It's 1929, and FIFA, a modest, somewhat optimistic organization barely 25 years old, has made a decision that most of Europe considers absolutely insane. The first ever FIFA World Cup will be held in Uruguay. Not Paris, not London, not Rome, Uruguay. A country of under 2 million people perched on the eastern edge of South America has been chosen to host the most ambitious football tournament ever conceived because they won gold at the 1924 and 1928 Olympics and because they promised to foot the bill. Europe laughed. Then Europe largely refused to come. The Atlantic crossing took 2 weeks by ship. The pay was modest. The stadiums didn't exist yet. England hadn't even joined FIFA. So when the tournament finally opened, only 13 nations showed up. 7 from South America, 4 from Europe, and 2 from North America. 13. For what would one day become the most watched sporting event in human history. But here's the thing about humble beginnings. They never look like beginnings at the time. The 1930 tournament was strange from the first whistle. France and Mexico kicked off on July 13th in front of a sparse crowd. The French striker Lucien Laurent scored the very first goal in World Cup history in the 19th minute, a crisp volley that almost nobody outside of Montevideo would hear about for days. But as the tournament progressed, something stirred. The games mattered, the crowds grew, and when Uruguay faced Argentina in the final, Montevideo transformed. Thousands of Argentine fans crossed the Rio de la Plata by boat. Police searched fans for weapons at the gates. The referee was escorted to the ground under armed guard. Uruguay won 4-2. The country declared a national holiday, and FIFA's mad experiment had just become a tradition. 4 years later, the World Cup arrived in Italy, and Benito Mussolini was ready. The 1934 tournament wasn't just a football competition. It was a stage set, a propaganda machine, a performance of fascist strength broadcast across the globe. Mussolini personally oversaw the selection of venues, the design of posters, the hiring of referees. When Italy's matches produced controversial decisions, opponents disallowed, fouls ignored, few dared say so out loud. Italy won. In 1938, hosted by France, they won again. 2 consecutive World Cups, both draped in the black shirts of fascism. The Argentine coach Guillermo Stabile called it the most politically poisoned tournament he had ever witnessed. He wasn't wrong, and then the world went to war. The 1942 and 1946 World Cups were canceled. 6 years of silence, not just from football, but from everything that looked like joy. When the tournament returned in 1950, it returned to Brazil, and it returned hungry. Over 200,000 people crammed into the Maracanã for the deciding match between Brazil and Uruguay. Not technically the final, the format was different, but everyone knew what it was. Brazil needed only a draw, Uruguay needed a win. What happened next haunted Brazil for generations. Uruguay won 2-1, the stadium fell silent, grown men wept in their seats, players locked themselves in dressing rooms for hours. Brazil's goalkeeper Moacir Barbosa was blamed, personally, viciously, endlessly for the rest of his life. He was never allowed to coach, never invited to national celebrations. He died in 2000 reportedly saying, "The maximum sentence in Brazil is 30 years. Mine was 50. That defeat had a name, the Maracanazo, and Brazil would carry it like an open wound. 1954, Bern, Switzerland. The so-called miracle of Bern. West Germany, a nation still rebuilding from the rubble of World War II, still partially occupied, still psychologically shattered, faced the Hungarian side that had not lost a single match in 4 years. Hungary's Ferenc Puskás was possibly the greatest player on earth. They had already beaten West Germany 8-3 in the group stage. The final ended 3-2. To West Germany, the economist and writer Heinrich Hauser later wrote that the victory felt like the moment West Germany was allowed to exist again. Football had done what politics could not. It gave a broken country its first shared moment of pride. And then came 1970, and everything changed color. The Mexico World Cup was the first broadcast in color television, and the timing was almost cosmically perfect, because Brazil's team that year was the most beautiful side ever assembled. Pelé, Jairzinho, Rivellino, Tostão. Every match looked like a painting in motion. Pelé's dummy against Uruguay, where he let the ball run past without touching it, sending the keeper the wrong way before narrowly missing, is still called the goal that never was. Still analyzed, still breathtaking. Brazil won the tournament. They kept the Jules Rimet trophy permanently, having won it 3 times. And the world, now watching in color, fell completely and irreversibly in love. 1986 Mexico City, the Azteca Stadium, quarterfinal, Argentina versus England. It had been 4 years since the Falklands War. 2 nations whose soldiers had killed each other were now separated only by a football pitch. The tension was something you could physically feel. Journalists described it as watching 2 countries fight a second battle with their feet. Then, in the 51st minute, Diego Maradona punched the ball into the net with his left hand. The referee didn't see it. The goal stood. Afterwards, Maradona smirked and said the goal was scored a little with the head of Maradona and a little with the hand of God. 4 minutes later, he scored again, collecting the ball in his own half and dribbling past 5 English players and the goalkeeper in 11 seconds, covering 60 meters. In what FIFA voters would later name the goal of the century. 2 goals, 1 game, 2 completely opposite faces of the same genius. Argentina went on to win the World Cup, and Maradona became myth. But for sheer stomach-dropping shock, nothing in World Cup history compares to what happened in Belo Horizonte on July 8, 2014. Brazil, home soil, semi-final. The nation that invented beautiful football, hosting the tournament for the first time in 64 years, carrying the ghost of the Maracanazo and determined to exorcise it. Their star Neymar was injured, their captain Thiago Silva suspended, but they had the crowd, they had the emotion, they had everything. Germany scored in the 11th minute, then the 23rd, then the 24th, then the 26th, then the 29th. 5 goals in 18 minutes. The Brazilian crowd went silent, not the silence of tension, but the silence of disbelief, of grief, of something that does not have a name. Fans were filmed weeping, children held their heads in their hands. One woman stood completely still, staring at nothing as the scoreboard climbed. The final score was 7-1. 7-1 in Brazil. In Brazil. German midfielder Toni Kroos said afterward that the team had tried not to celebrate too extravagantly out of respect. The word the Brazilians used was simple: humilhação, humiliation. It trended globally within minutes. A new wound had been added to the old one. Behind every World Cup, of course, there is another game being played, one that has no referees and very few rules. FIFA, the governing body that controls world football, grew from a modest Paris office in 1904 into one of the most powerful and financially opaque organizations on Earth. By the 2000s, it controlled billions in television rights, sponsorship deals, and hosting fees, with almost no independent oversight. In 2015, the United States Department of Justice indicted 14 FIFA officials on charges of racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering. Sepp Blatter, FIFA's president for 17 years, resigned within days. Investigations revealed decades of systematic bribery for hosting rights, for broadcast contracts, for votes that shaped which nations got to stand on the world's biggest stage. Qatar's hosting of the 2022 World Cup, awarded in 2010 under circumstances that remain disputed, brought the politics into sharp, uncomfortable focus. Played in November rather than June to avoid lethal heat, built on the labor of migrant workers whose conditions drew international condemnation, staged in a country where same-sex relationships remained illegal. The tournament was simultaneously a sporting spectacle and a moral reckoning. And yet, and this is the uncomfortable truth, the football was extraordinary. Argentina and France delivered a final for the ages. Lionel Messi, 35 years old, lifted the trophy he had spent his entire career chasing, and 4 billion people watched. 4 billion, over half the people alive on Earth. In 2026, the World Cup expands to 48 teams for the first time, hosted across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. More nations, more stories, More chances for a 17-year-old from Senegal or a goalkeeper from Iceland to step onto that stage and change everything. The tournament that started with 13 teams and wet paint on stadium walls now stops traffic in Lagos, silences offices in Tokyo, fills streets in Buenos Aires at midnight. There is no rational explanation for why a ball crossing a white line should make a grown man cry, or why a single match can suspend a war, or why a penalty kick taken under floodlights in a foreign city can define a generation's memory of who they were. But it does. It always has. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the World Cup endures not because football is the world's game, but because it is the world's mirror. Every 4 years, humanity gathers around it and sees exactly who it is. The question is whether we like what we see. If history is your obsession, subscribe to the Time Thread.